right, we're back with myself, Johnny, and Pat. How you going?
Oh, how's it going, Johnny?
Oh, good. Almost there.
Indeed. End of a pretty busy year.
Yeah, it was. I'll start off with a video from the Hoover Institute about the cause of the 2008 GFC.
Let's take a step back. 1983 until 2008, the American economy experiences a quarter of a century of nearly uninterrupted economic growth. Then, beginning in the autumn of 2008, trouble. What went wrong?
Well, actually, it started much earlier, and I think it was the housing boom, followed by the housing bust, which occurred in 2006.
2006, much
and
earlier.
So the reverberations of that is, there are people out there who had trillions of dollars invested in securities based upon mortgages, and when people stopped paying their mortgages, the value of the securities vanished into thin air.
So you do not argue that this was a financial crisis that spilled over into the real economy. You argue that it was a problem in the real economy, particularly the housing market,
Yes.
that started the problem in the financial sector.
Oh, absolutely. If people had kept paying their mortgages, the securities would have been good, and we would have all lived happily ever after. Now the problem is that the politicians made the mortgages more risky by changing the rules. In other words, at one time, mortgages were considered the safest investment. This is for the widows and orphans who need their money coming in regularly, and you put it into real estate. But the politicians decided that we must have more home ownership and more affordable housing. And so they began to prescribe rules. You had to lend money to people you wouldn't have lent to before. And of course, there was a reason they weren't lending to them before. And we discovered the hard way what that reason was, that they weren't likely to be able to pay them back.
I just cut off there. But I like how you summarize some of the stuff we discussed from part one. That is, housing markets were a very stable and secure way to earn your income.
Yeah.
And then, the widows, the orphans, if their parents died, then they still had the house pass on to them, and they can sell that house and to generate income. But now the idea is that the governments won't come involved and say, we want everyone to have home ownership, and let's change the rules so that you can now lend to anyone that you want without this
regardless of their ability or means to actually pay back the loan.
Yes.
Yeah.
And all that does is set this ticking time bomb, which we found later on in 2006 in the GFC, that they can't afford these houses.
Thomas Sowell is economic genius in that his ability to look at a problem and explain the problem in a way that is clear and it makes sense.
So I'll quickly recap some of the stuff that we talked last session, and then we'll jump into it. So from last session, we talked about perceptions within government and people based on reports. There were discrimination against minorities and low-income earners in home loans. So what we needed to do was to make things equal by pushing the law to lower credit requirements and to put quotas to force the banks to do the law. And then any banks that wouldn't comply with the law would have future business decisions such as new branch openings or mergers denied by the government. There was another one about the Community Reinvestment Act in 1977 that gave government authorities the instrument to enforce such laws. And then when there's further media outrage, the government adds these extra rules on the assumption that people are following the laws. The assumption is that, the government knows best, or we know best, and we are correct. So these guys these bureaucrats are located far away from the center of business and transactions. They don't conduct the face-to-face bank interviews for loans. They assume that they're qualified and they're correct, and they can dictate how business is done. So that's like, good intentions gone bad. And then we talked about enabling factors, which are the laws that allow this to be a legit action, So, predatory loans, not good.
Yeah.
But because now you're forced to give out these loans to people who really can't afford to do these things.
Yeah. Well, especially if you're marketing to them and saying, hey, you don't have to put a down payment, you don't have to pay it's delay on the interest, no credit check, nothing. That's the sort of marketing push of getting people through the door. It's setting up a giant house of cards that's going to collapse on itself eventually.
Yep. So what are the other contributing factors? So we talked about enabling factors. Now we need to look at impelling factors, so likelihood. So what was what increased the probability of this occurring, and then what was the actual trigger, that is the precipitating factor. That's what Thomas Sowell breaks it down. So what increased the likelihood of people taking up these subprime loans? And I just gathered a bit of material from his book. And remember housing restriction laws we talked about in the episode about, buying the dream home?
Yeah.
Stuff like environmental laws, minimum lot sizes, building densities, zoning, all those laws artificially restrict the supply of housing because the builder and the supplier is unable to meet demand in a quick enough way. Like, if you want to build a certain house, a 3-story house, you need to go apply for a permit. Well, it takes time, it takes money.
Yeah. Got to cut through all the red tape.
Yep.
All the bureaucracy.
So these things artificially restrict the supply of housing, and that contributes to, soaring house prices. The other one side is buying, so speculating on house prices that they will continue to soar and saying, we will never have a housing crisis. This was like, pre-2006, mindset. And,
Essentially the banks were too big to fail, was the expression.
Or it's more like, I remember in Sydney, one of my cousins saying, Sydney house prices will never drop.
Right. When was this?
2000 and it was either 2004 to 2007.
Okay.
Yeah, somewhere between that. So just before the GFC.
Just before the GFC.
Now I don't really have the actual stats of Sydney house, Sydney house bust. I don't. Do you remember if there was a bust in?
I don't remember.
But people just did feel some of the effects of the GFC in Australia, just not as much as say America.
Yeah.
So people think it's going back. People think it's good to flip houses and to turn that tiny profit we talked about before. Buy one house and then you get a phone call. Hey, I want to buy it now.
Yeah.
And I can flip this before these,
do a little bit of renovation and then increase its value and move it on.
And then because houses are hot, then you'll be able to get it off the market before the penalty period starts kicking in.
Yeah.
And then we talk about first home buyers, buy now rather than later. The loan is therefore worth it because locking that loan at a lower amount because you are expecting house prices to keep soaring. So get it now than later. For each of these group, the buyers, the speculators, the low-income house owners, it made sense to them, according to the environment, to use these subprime mortgages because of a perceived housing shortage and expected soaring house prices. The reality was the housing shortage was caused by artificial restrictions that drove up housing prices, but mortgages was one of the methods for buyers to extend the credit to enter a competitive market. So lenders, so there's demand by the regulators to buy low credit loans, and the government enforces these regulations. So in terms of defaulting on loans and the bust, areas that had these restricted supplies of housing and high housing prices were more likely to have these subprime mortgages. So, from his book, Sowell writes, these risks were not hypothetical. In the same issue of the New York Times, in which this story appeared, another news story appeared under the headline, Mortgage Delinquencies Soar. 1 in 10 borrowers is at least a month behind on payments. For FHA loans, more than 14% of borrowers were at least a month behind on their payments. These problems, like many of the other housing problems during the boom and bust, were concentrated in 4 states: California, Florida, Arizona, and Nevada. In Florida, 1/4 of all people with mortgages were behind in their payments. So we think, subprime mortgage crisis and GFC, it was all over America.
Yeah.
Well, no, because it's more located on...
It was localized to the individual
California, Florida. So I guess these places would have these housing laws in place which artificially restricted supply.
One interesting thing about the makeup of the United States is that you have many individual states with very different rules on very different laws and rules within each of those states. And the design of the United States was to be kind of a melting pot of ideas where each state could try different things out independent of the others, and if there were consequences to those decisions, it would hurt the states, the individual states.
Yeah.
But the design was for the ramifications of bad decision making enacted by different states, it wouldn't carry over and impact its neighbors.
Yeah, if I take a step back and think about the whole, federal government then state government, right?
Yeah.
Like we see it in Australia. How different states react to coronavirus.
Yeah, we have.
I was like,
yeah.
Victoria was just, I'm not sure. How would you describe it?
Um,
They went in very loose, and then when the spikes occurred,
They cracked down hard.
because they had the BLM protests,
Yeah.
beginning in March
that they encouraged, that the state government encouraged.
Now, I'm not sure whether you can directly contribute the activism with with the spikes and spreads, but it's like,
What the state government said was that this protest for Black Lives Matter was A-OK. You could go there and protest, but anti-lockdown protest, that was bad. You can't do that. Why?
it didn't make sense.
It was essentially the approach that the Victorian state government went down was there was no consistent standard.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of confusion created because going, I can do this, but I can't do this. It's the same type of thing, but there's slight differences. There was no consistent standard. Whereas if you compare New South Wales or Queensland, each state tried different things, and I think that out of all the states, probably New South Wales has probably done the best. I think.
Really?
I think so, at least.
Okay. I haven't really looked into
Queensland's probably close second.
Because what I'm really tired of is just
Yeah.
listening to infection rates rather than mortality and recovery rates.
Yes. Yeah.
Because the infection rates, it's an airborne disease.
Yeah. Of course, you're going to get infected. There's a high likelihood of getting infected. The question is, are you going to die from this?
Did we actually see hospitals at full capacity?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that one.
Yeah.
The good news that isn't reported though is the recovery rate. You've tapped on something really important there. But each of the states approached the problem in different ways, and there was a big call around about, I think it was around June, July, to throw that out and go, we need a universal approach. We need the government in Canberra to dictate the rules for the entire nation. When you make a call for that, what you often don't think about is how do you logistically manage something like that to that scale? It's almost inconceivable.
No, and it's like federalizing firefighting services.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like the bushfire.
How do you know when the bushfire is there? You need to send word, and then you need to mobilize the firefighters, and then you're going, okay, how many do we send? What's the proportionate response?
Yeah, because I think you'd be concerned if, like, say, if it's all centralized, then someone who's not part of your local state will say, well, New South Wales is burning more than Queensland, so let's send all the Queensland firefighters into New South Wales. Like, oh, how do you feel about that?
Exactly.
It's your own homes you're looking after.
Yeah. So, and this is where, if we switch back to America, where the federal government created institutions such as Freddie Mae, Freddie Mac,
Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. Yeah.
Thank you. When they created those institutions to try and correct the perceived problems within the housing market, which we discussed in the last episode, talking about that these problems were the perception that there was inherent racism in home ownership. When you create these federal institutions to try and govern home loans, it's too big a problem to solve with one group of people on the federal level, because they are too separated or divorced from the actual people's decisions they're impacting.
Yeah, and they
can't know.
And they don't have the right stats. Like all you had from that study was the stats that said approval and denial rates, and then what race were they and what income level they were. Yeah, they didn't say, okay, what grounds were they rejected, what was the collateral that they were putting up.
Not important.
I think it's important.
Oh, sorry. I'm talking on behalf of the of the institution. They go, that's not important information. But you and I would go, no, that's critical information that's needed to make an informed decision.
Yeah.
Obviously, that wasn't what happened. But I think it's because the decision makers were so far removed from the people directly impacted by the decisions that there was no conceivable way for them to know what the impact of their decisions actually were going to have.
Mm-hmm.
So they just chug along, and then institution created this house of cards that then fell in on itself. It ended up that the individual citizens living in states outside of, now was it California, Nevada, Florida, and Arizona?
Yes.
People living outside of those states, their lives are then ruined as well as a direct repercussion of decisions that were made by other states.
Yeah. All right. So that was impelling factors, and we saw that the likelihood wasn't universal across the whole of America, but it was certain states.
Yeah.
But they had that flow on, as you said.
Yeah.
All right. So the next one was precipitating factors. So what was a trigger that led to the subprime mortgage crisis, and what was the thing that caused all the dominoes to fall? So what we listened to earlier from Thomas Sowell was that if people simply kept the mortgages, there'll be no crisis, right?
Yeah.
The money will keep going through, and we all will live happily ever after.
Happily ever after.
but how is that happily ever after when you notice a ticking time bomb?
Yeah.
All right, so these
if you're a politician, you go, oh, that's a can. Let me kick that down the road a little bit longer.
so these toxic loans were still perceived as valuable when the income was coming through, and it stopped when they were defaulted. So as soon as they defaulted, they were worthless. And so why did people default on these loans? Well, it's because of falling house prices was one of the key factors. If you were one of the speculators, if you were buying a home and you were maintaining that mortgage and you were almost creeping into that penalty rates, and all of a sudden interest rates rose, then you couldn't keep up. But I do believe from the scenario that we read is that in 2006, interest rates rose first because they couldn't keep it at the all-time low.
Yeah. At the all-time low being artificially deflated. It would be deflated, wouldn't
Suppressed.
it? Yeah, suppressed. Artificial suppression. That's a good term. Yeah.
And so artificial suppression, eventually, they have to increase it. And as a result, demand fell.
Yep.
And then house prices fell. And then all of a sudden, people were defaulting on their home loans. And then you had that sort of cycle, falling house prices and also interest rates rising as well. So there was also one incorrect assumption is that people weren't able to pay, or some inability to pay. The turning point in 2006 was, as we said, it was they chose to stop paying.
Yeah.
I will read another passage. So from Sowell, it says, in short, even some people who could not afford to pay off their mortgages were now faced with incentives to stop doing so. People who had borrowed against the equity in their homes were, of course, at increased risk of finding that what they owed now exceeded the value of the remaining equity in their home, when they had both a mortgage to pay and a home equity loan to repay. Here too were people who were not trapped by circumstances beyond their control, but who had simply chosen risky ways of getting money and loss. So home equity loan was one of the key things. And that's a loan that you could borrow money and use your house as collateral.
Yeah.
And what you could do was sell that house as a backup.
Yeah.
But
So essentially, we have a similar model in Australia where you can get a second mortgage out on your house. Same sort of idea. But obviously that's on the proviso that you can pay back the second loan in addition to the first loan, and so the mortgage that's on your house as well. But the risk of that is that if you default on either loan, then your house is the bank's.
and then your house is also worthless,
Exactly.
which affects the whole housing market.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a very different story if this happens on an individual level, or if there's a small handful of loans that default. The market can compensate for that, and it manages itself. But we're talking about hundreds of thousands of homes. Is that actually? I don't know the stat.
Talk about what was the stat we read? Like 588,000.
588,000. That was loans, right?
But those were people who could afford to pay the loan but
Right.
chose not to because it was meaningless.
Right. So it's possibly we don't have the stat, do we, for how many could not pay? Correct.
No, I'm pretty sure it's in the book.
Yeah.
But
For sake of what we're talking about right here, we're talking about mass numbers of loans defaulting at exactly the same time.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we just read all all the stuff there. So the next bit was reactions and solutions. And this is a bit where I rather just read from the book because I want the listeners to also look at the book as well. I've just summarized some of the reactions that you would get. And they're predictable reactions. So one was corporate greed. These bankers are too greedy and they made these really bad decisions. So the counter argument is that some of these corporations and banks, so Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, and investment corporations, they also lost money. And if you're also executive, you had your stock options and you had your bonuses. So them were compensated in the form of shares, right?
Yeah.
So they also lost money as well. But you got to understand that why do we talk about it's not their fault? It's because not totally their fault.
Not entirely, yeah.
Was that the laws were put in place.
Yeah.
The laws were set up by the government. So lending to low-income people or people that you would know would not be able to pay was still legalized by these acts, and they were also encouraged. I think, when you say about corporate greed, it's a scapegoat, it's a blame thing that the government will say.
Yeah. It's essentially it's the argument that's often made when the government doesn't want to accept responsibility. In this case, when the government did not want to accept responsibility for the hand that they played.
Here's another one. It was the deregulation that was put in place. We've given too much trust to these corporations. But the counter argument is that it ignores government pressures put on the banks. So Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, they were given quotas, and they were also looking to buy these subprime mortgages or loans given to low credit score rating people. Government solutions. So in the scenario that is put out there by the media and people out there, is that banks are evil, we're giving them too much trust, they got out of control. What's the counter solution? It's more government regulations. And so we had politicians rose to defend Community Reinvestment Act. They were also offering banks the bailouts. They were also protecting these subprime mortgages, trying to, that the dam is busting and cracks coming in when people just keep defaulting on their loans. So let's insure them. Let's use government taxpayers' money.
But we spoke about the lunacy of if government regulation or government interference created a problem, and your solution then is to create more government regulation to correct the problem. That's lunacy, because then you just keep more government regulation keeps coming in to try and sticky tape the sinking ship.
Yeah, it's not a band-aid, it's more sticky tape. I think one thing to reflect on is that perhaps sometimes you need to know maybe these solutions, these regulations might hamper correcting the behavior rather than helping people make those correct decisions.
Well, I think that one thing in reflection here is that this entire situation, this entire story that we're talking about, it highlights the need of the people to understand or know what the correct purpose of government actually is. That's a discussion, a conversation we have. Okay, what do we want the government to actually do? Or better question is, what should it do and what shouldn't it do? If we have that sort of conversation,
what, get involved in marriage, get involved with relationships, get involved with universities, healthcare.
At every step we've invited the government in, and really the purpose. Again, we have different levels of government, right? But if we're talking specific about the federal government, its primary job, its function is, as I see it, is national defense, but also keeping the... How do you describe it?
Keeping the laws and keeping the courts and the justice system.
That's it, yeah. I'll let you chop that. Sorry, I bungled that one.
Thinking about why is interest rates low nowadays, and I think it's because of the fear of if we increase interest rates, then we'll end up triggering this kind of recession going on. But you had to, at some time, according to the situation, increase interest rates. I think I've never seen interest rates go any higher ever since the GFC. And so for kids who are saving up, who want to open up a savings account, you're almost not worth putting that money in the banks.
No, of course not. No. Only benefit at this point of putting it in the bank, putting savings into the bank, is it's got theoretically it's a safe place to put it. where it's not going to get stolen. That's pretty much it. It's like, so you don't have to keep it in a little lockbox underneath your mattress or something.
Yeah.
Like, outside of that, there's no value.
One of the other things that Sowell notes is the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, which are these stimulus programs to bail out these banks and corporations. Money is injected into the system, but what he notes, it doesn't come in right away. It's usually over a period. It comes in lots. And so it's too slow.
Yeah.
And therefore, the job loss is at a higher rate than job creation. Yeah, we talked about what is the flow onto people morally, spiritually, mentally. And is that, you can count on the government. The message is you can count on the government to clean up mistakes.
Yeah.
And does it encourage you to take more or less risk? Well, it takes...
more or less responsibility as well for those mistakes.
Yeah. Well, less responsibility and more risk because someone can clean up after you. But, seeing banks get away with it, seeing the politicians who created all these rules in the first place, then also jump into like the hearings and be the judges is very demoralizing. You can't trust that.
Well, it demoralized the people to the point of going, we can't trust. There was a loss of trust in, we'll call it, the American institutions that had been there for decades, if not a century or more. And suddenly that was ripped away violently, and people went, we can't trust you.
Yeah. And I
think that does a lot of harm to the social fabric as well.
I do think that too, because I link it back to, like, say, Douglas Murray's bit about, say, what's happening with this transgenderism, racism issues, BLM, fourth generation feminism. He links it with the GFC. He says the ideas were all there in the first place, but you needed a mass sort of, what do you call it, some kind of social disorder, disruption, which caused people to lack faith in themselves and look for other meanings.
Yeah.
If you studied something like the Weimar Republic and the rise of Nazism, you had the Great Depression, and then people were looking for, they couldn't trust in the Weimar Republic. They thought that was corrupt, and so they turned towards the communists or the Nazis.
Or the fascism.
Yeah. So, what is the counter argument towards all these government solutions? And Thomas Sowell is a free market economist, studied under Milton Friedman, and
was a Marxist originally.
He was a Marxist.
Which is a fascinating story. But
yeah. So one thing he writes is, ironically, two Russian economists in the days of the Soviet Union saw a key fact about market economies that so many who live in market economies have missed. Everything is interconnected in the world of prices so that the smallest change in one element is passed along the chain to millions of others. And so, let's get government out of the way. Let's let prices, not government policies, dictate how we use our resources, and to tell the buyers, the demand, and suppliers what's the best way to use their resources.
Yeah.
And so do we let the market self-correct? He uses a case study about the Great Depression, the New Deal, given by FDR. So one thing he notes is that perhaps other countries without the stimulus and the intervention of the New Deal were able to recover quicker than America. And that is until World War II occurs, and then economies of all the other nations were devastated, while America, all the industry was relatively intact, whereas Europe, Asia, all of them were pretty much devastated.
Yeah.
So he writes, it is of course not possible to conduct laboratory experiments to determine what would have happened without government intervention after the stock market crash of 1929. The closest thing to such an experiment might be experienced after the stock market crash of 1987, a decline very similar to that in 1929. The 1987 stock market crash is not remembered as vividly today as the earlier stock market crash because its aftermath was so different. Unlike what had been done by Presidents Hoover and Roosevelt, President Ronald Reagan did not intervene in 1987 despite media criticisms of his inaction. The net result of leaving the stock market and the economy to recover on their own was what the distinguished British magazine The Economist later called 20 years of an enviable combination of steady growth and low inflation. This was not the only time when doing nothing produced a better track record than massive government interventions. A sharp economic downturn in the early 1920s was allowed to recover on its own and quickly did so. There have been similar results in other countries. J.A. Schumpeter, writing in the 1930s about the economic downturn in England back in the 1820s, said, "The inaction of government, however reprehensible on humanitarian grounds, contributed to recovery at least by not hampering it."
Yeah.
Because, one of the things I've noted by economists is, what can government do to help? Not getting in the way of business decisions to make the best business actions.
Well, that decision highlights the two different approaches the government can engage down, the two different pathways, if you would. One is government intervention and
Inaction?
inaction. Oh, no, it's not inaction, though. That's the thing.
All right, well, this is where I would ask yourself, Pat. It's like, what should we do then?
What, you're looking to me for all the answers?
Or do you agree with Thomas Sowell's argument?
Oh, yeah. I think that his observation is pretty on point. This entire story is showing what happens when you have government interfering in something that it doesn't understand. And because by its very nature, politicians are looking maximum 4 years in the future for their next re-election. So all of their decisions are focused around the short term as opposed to the long term of what happens.
Yeah.
So that's where you get a lot of kicking the can down the road. It's not a problem right now, but if I kick it down the road far enough, that problem will eventually be someone else's problem to deal with.
Yeah.
So we're seeing this story is highlighting what happens when in this case, the American government set up institutions to tinker and tamper with the natural progression of the market. And we can now see the reaction of what happens when the market was artificially suppressed, and then it exploded and caused undue amounts of hurt and pain.
Mm-hmm. And now we're trying to suppress it even further because they're fearing one of those crises happening again.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's probably hard for the government to be inactive or hands-off. Hands-off
That's
approach.
a good word, yeah.
Because you have the scrutiny of mass media, social media, and the speed of information goes around. So one thing that comes to mind is that when the federal government in the bushfires, I remember that there was a volunteer bushfire saying, he got caught on the news, on the media. He was driving a truck and saw him leading on the truck and goes, he was giving the F-bombs all to Morrison.
Yeah, I remember that.
But at that time, it was each of the state governments were managing the fires.
Yeah.
So what does it got to do with
the federal government?
With the federal government?
It doesn't. The issue here is that Morrison is the leader, so all of the praise and the blame and hatred gets lumped onto his shoulders. That's just what happens.
Which is probably unfair.
It's definitely unfair, but that's a bit of human nature as well, is that we look to the leader for all answers. That's almost like a bit of a human condition, a flaw almost, if you would, is that we're looking for someone at the top to tell us what to do.
Yeah. And
even if, though, the blame is misplaced, if it's actually someone lower down the pecking order, closer to home, if you would.
Yeah, and I think that sort of just increases like the chance of other organizations which are at the easy levers which the federal government can use. And what's the quickest, readiest response agency that the federal government can use? Military.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Which again, we were talking before. The role of the national government is defense, ensure that people are playing by the rules, the laws, and enforcing those laws, right? Making sure that people play by the rules.
Yeah.
And they're not breaking the non-aggression principle. That should be the purpose of government. Right now, we are dealing with governments all over the world that are massively expanded, and they have their fingers in all these different areas and things that they aren't experts in. I remember with the bushfires, I remember the I think it might have been the New South Wales or Victorian state government. I can't remember which one. But one of the fire agencies said that, hey, we have fire engines that are 15, 20 years old. And my first comment to that was, why have you not kept your fleet up to date?
It's Morrison's fault.
Obviously, yeah.
That's what.
Yeah, blame the Prime Minister. Well, essentially, that's what our media unfortunately did. They went to him and asked for a soundbite and went, "What do you have to say about this?" Like, I don't know. It's not. I'm not responsible for keeping the state fire engines up to date. Go talk to the premiers. But the problem is that if he didn't say that, but if he were to say that, he'd be labelled as passing the buck.
Yeah, it'll be good to know what happens from the Royal Commission.
Yeah,
because I think that's one of the terms of reference that they were looking at the federal government's response to fires as well.
Yeah.
But another thing, when you talk about, it's all on the Prime Minister, it's like, well, I think in aviation there's a thing called accountability versus responsibility.
Yes.
Managers. So the responsible managers do some of the actions. He's like the guy on the front lines, whereas the accountable manager is, well, his responsibility is to provide guidance and assign resources.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of difference in there.
Yeah.
Another thing I've noted is that government managed response to COVID-19 is it better to take a light or heavy-handed approach, and are we actually counting other costs? Small business, mental health, unemployment, future debt, are those counted as part of the trade-offs versus saving all these people away from the virus? I'm not sure. Do you remember the news where, I think this came out recently, that they did a study on Japan's deaths, right?
Yeah.
And they said there are more people in Japan who committed suicide
Yes.
than the COVID deaths.
Yes, I heard that.
As a result of these lockdowns.
I think it was in the month of September, I think.
Yeah.
Specifically, they were focused in on that month and compared that. Yeah.
My critiques, I guess, one of the lessons learned, or some of the lessons learned, is that we don't learn from history. We have a danger of trusting in humans.
Yeah.
But, humans are fallible. There's no accountability for political mistakes because we have these fixed terms. Like, whereas business, you can fire your CEO.
Yeah.
There's a loud voice in media and public. And if you have those on the political side, then you can pretty much change the narrative of whatever was going on. So one of the sad things was that politicians who were involved with these laws and regulations were allowed, which enabled this to happen, were also the judges and the people who demand responses from the banks. It's like, well, you're not innocent in this case. I think it's also a lesson for us about how the government gets involved with certain areas. So you can apply this to university, education, healthcare, all these other areas. And we talked about this before, about the learned helplessness that we turn to politicians and government for answers when maybe perhaps, and this is not a slight against them, but they are just a bunch of regular people. They're no dumber, they're no smarter for these decisions, but they're also less accountable in some sense, because how you can easily fire within the private industry. It's harder to remove these people who are put into fixed terms in government.
Yeah.
Any reflections from yourself, mate?
Well, probably to tap into what you've already reflected on in regards to the role of government, I was actually reminded of a quote by James Madison, the fourth US president. And it's his quite a succinct description of what the purpose of government, the role of government has. And the quote is this, is that if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. And I find that as a really interesting quote because it taps into the idea that government is made up of human beings who are, by their very nature, fallible. And government is a necessity. You need government to put to control, because if you didn't have any control, then people would run amok and you'd have anarchy.
Yeah.
So you do need government, but it's a recognition that government is flawed. So it needs to have controls and measures put in place to rein in abuse of power. And I think what we've been talking about over the past two episodes is a case of where government has exercise power it was not delegated to by the US Constitution, and we've seen the wreckage that interference has actually caused.
Yeah, and I think there's another bit is that people always say this is a failure of capitalism, that we need to have socialism, or we need to give government intervention. But as Thomas Sowell points out, it's that the free market, the housing market, it wasn't quite free.
No.
And so if you look at trying to get government out there, out of the market, out of the housing market, and stop them from hampering supplies, from being able to meet the demand, you could get a better result.
Yeah. What is often not acknowledged is the economic system that is capitalism that we've been using in Western countries for, I'd say, about 200 odd years now. What it has done to impact the lives of everyday citizens, it has brought so many people out of poverty. You go back 100 years and compare what your lower income earners were living like, their living conditions, and compare that to what we have now, and it's night and day.
Yeah.
So I look at that and go, when I hear the call to throw out capitalism, replace it with some other model of governing us, also running a society's economics, and I look at that and go, are you crazy? That means you're going to throw out a system that has given us that it has created so much for both the wealthy, yes, but also the least. It's brought everyone up. I look at those sort of calls with a lot of skepticism, because it's often coming from people who haven't actually critically examined a lot of these issues and tapped into just beyond just the superficial headlines or the initial, just a single data point, and dug a little bit deeper below the surface.
Yeah. Well, I think that wraps up the actual topic of the subprime mortgage crisis in part 2. So what I want to do now is to actually look back at this year. We only started this podcast beginning of the year when COVID hit, and now we're like, all right, there's something to do. It's actually something that we planned off last year, and Pat's just come on. He's happily. I remember we had the interview, and we just like, yeah, would you like to come on the podcast and bounce some ideas? And
it's been a lot of fun. We've tackled a lot of different issues over the last 12 months, haven't we?
Yeah. Well, this was planned, I guess. Last year, and then we developed some scripts. So then, whilst it was released in March, the whole thing was about 12-month project.
Yeah.
I'm gonna ask you some questions, mate. So, what were some of the things that you took away from doing this project?
A lot of the topics we've spoken about initially, I hadn't necessarily thought all that much of. So this was actually a really interesting opportunity to dig into some topics that I wasn't initially very familiar with, but you apply critical thinking skills to examine topics and dig a little bit deeper. Probably one that jumps out to me was the sustainable energy, nuclear. I didn't know that much about a lot of the research and the information that we discussed leading up to that discussion, but obviously reading through some of the information, digging that a little bit deeper, I learned so much more.
What particularly did you take away from that episode?
Probably how much misinformation I had just absorbed as that was fact. So we discussed that, hey, nuclear actually is a viable source of energy that would solve a lot of problems, but it's been cast as the boogeyman almost. So I guess again it comes down. I think it comes down to being able to apply critical thinking skills to issues that I'm not necessarily familiar with, and that being the starting point, then informing myself, researching the topic, and coming away with a lot more information. Yeah.
That's good. So you learned more from that episode, or one of the things one of the episodes that you noted that you learned more was the nuclear one.
Yeah.
What was the most enjoyable podcast?
I'd probably say it was the sunflower. I'll get the full title.
Or was it the Hell in Session one?
Sorry?
Which one? Was it the prison camp?
Let me have a quick look at the name.
Was it the Vietnam War POW, or was it the World War II one?
It was the Vietnam War one, Inner Freedom.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I found that one quite fascinating because it was very confronting looking at the experiences of
It was JC. It was Jeremiah Denton.
Jeremiah Denton, of what Jeremiah Denton went through, and it was incredibly impressive and inspiring in a way to hear that he was able to persevere through. Yeah.
Okay, that's good. I like that one as well. That was one of the books I actually wanted to talk about because not many people know about that story.
Yeah.
And you can see it now in the media. I think there's one particular TV show where they had some guy captured, and then he was put on the TV and he was blinking the Morse code, and the Morse code the idea was originated in that book.
Of course, yes, that's
by
right.
Denton.
Yeah.
What we wanted to do was to actually share a message out there to, say, Australians and also hopefully around the world who might be looking, hey, what do these Australians talk about? And if some of you guys can guess that, we have a Christian background, but I didn't want to be Bible bashing. But I do know, or my beliefs is that some of the issues, if you scratch the surface of them, that you actually find a spiritual issue. So the Finding Love podcast, that was, the relationship podcast, I felt like that was also a spiritual issue, that people were putting spiritual burdens on their partners, which are unfairly so.
Yeah.
If you want to look at, say, Finding Meaning with Marcus Aurelius, the Stoics, all that kind of stuff, that was also a spiritual issue. We're not learning from mistakes. Or we talked a fair bit about organizational failures and the failure to learn from history. It's the old arrogance and pride of humanity that we know best, and we end up just forgetting about the lessons we learned earlier on. But I didn't want to compete against, religious podcasts, because I think when I look at Australian people, we are religiously apathetic, which can be a good and a bad thing. I think America is fairly religious. It's all around the news and TV and billboards, whereas Australians, it takes a bit more effort to sort of reach out to them.
I think it's also the conversations that we have between each week here is that we're not just looking at things through a spiritual or religious lens. It's that's a facet of the conversation, but what we're talking about here is a host of other aspects of ways you can examine an issue as well.
Yeah.
So,
but even like if you say Australians are religiously apathetic, the humanity is religious at heart. That we like to.
There is a spiritual component that we're trying to understand.
Yeah, that we like to worship something, and we're not talking about people bowing down, but we hold things sacred, or we hold things taboo, and we can shame people when we can
and shame and praise people.
Shame and praise people at the same time. So one of the things I usually tell to other people is that what is your spiritual idol? What do you hold dear to you? You just go to the news agent and you can look at them the roles of magazine, and which magazines do you usually go for first? Is it fishing, golfing, holidaying, weddings, relationships, modeling? I don't know. Okay, so Pat, because for some listeners out there, I usually do some research and I share the ideas with Pat. Now, if you could develop an episode, what would you look at writing up?
I'd probably be interested in tapping into, being half American, I'm quite interested in US history, US politics, but it's not just let's talk about today's politics. I'm interested in looking at, I have a particular fascination with America's founding and that government was originally created, and seeing if there are lessons that can be learnt from what they did then and apply those to now, and how we can try and probably work on fixing some of the problems that we see in the world today. Yeah.
Okay.
That might be something interesting to look forward to down the road.
All right. Any last messages for our listeners?
No, not really.
All right. Well, guys, I'll just end this episode. So if you want to reach us, go to Twitter at Fire in the Desert, or email us with some ideas and comments at thefireinthedesert@gmail.com. Like, share, and subscribe, and put on your social media. It gives us motivation to produce more episodes. And I guess have a good Christmas, have a good break, and we'll see you guys next year. Music is Outfoxing the Fox by Kevin MacLeod at incomtech.com.